Todd. Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who is here virtually joining us today. We are thrilled to see so much interest in federal funding for legal aid, and we're really looking forward to today's robust discussion. As Attorney General Garland has said, there can be no equal justice without equal access to justice. And that is why the work of the Office for Access to Justice is so critical. The mission of our office is to ensure access to the promises and protections of our civil and criminal legal systems for all communities. As part of this mission, our office is proud to direct and staff the work of the White House Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, or LAIR, a collaboration of 28 federal agencies, co-chaired by Attorney General Garland and White House counsel. One of our speakers today, Karen Lash, was actually formerly in the Office for Access to Justice, and she led and first launched LAIR, allowing this impactful interagency work to continue today. The Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, or LAIR, undertakes a number of initiatives to address access to justice issues across the federal government, including fostering innovative interagency work and outreach to legal aid organizations. In 2023, LAIR's report and work focused on people's access to assistance, both from lawyers and non-lawyers, and other strategies to further access to justice in federal administrative proceedings. Our 2023 LAIR report has been widely shared, and the federal examples it contains serve as inspiration for work at the state level, and we've heard are prompting more research into non-lawyer assistance in administrative proceedings. We're thrilled to see this sort of response to LAIR's work. In discussing federal administrative proceedings, the LAIR report also noted that many federal agencies provide funding and training resources to legal aid programs for issues connected to agency missions. Agency-funded legal services have expanded access and improved outcomes in many life-altering contexts, from housing stability to tax disputes to healthcare and veterans or Social Security claims. Put simply, collaboration and support with civil legal aid is integral to the success of agency programs that aim to reach communities across the country, and more generally, to pursuing the agency's goals. And the reverse is also true. Support from these agencies is deeply important for civil legal aid programs. Civil legal aid funding data compiled by the American Bar Association makes this quite clear. Of course, the Legal Services Corporation, or LSC, plays an essential role in delivering federal funding to legal service organizations. But other sources of government funds also comprise a significant share of legal aid funding nationwide, supporting diverse legal aid programs that are funded by a wide array of agencies. This reality means that many legal aid organizations rely heavily on their ability to identify, apply for, and leverage these many sources of federal funding, including through innovative partnerships and pilots. We've heard from legal aid organizations that these opportunities and certain challenges that come with them are top of mind. We know that the federal government is complex, large, and there are many different agencies that offer funding of interest to legal service providers, including many programs in which legal assistance is just one of many allowable services. For these reasons and others, despite the committed work of issuing agencies, some funding opportunities can be hard to identify and apply for. So in response, we are absolutely thrilled to host today's webinar, where we believe that we will provide a helpful insight into the federal funding landscape, some of the many resources available to help navigate the federal funding landscape, including a recently launched resource from our office, and third, tips and strategies to use these federal funding sources to create meaningful and sustainable impact. So I want to thank our distinguished panelists and speakers today, and in particular, the Office for Access to Justice team for all your hard work in planning this webinar. I will now turn it over to the Executive Director of the White House Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable, Allie Young-Green, who will get us started and introduce our speakers today. Thanks, Allie.
Thank you, Rachel, for those opening remarks. Hello, everyone. My name is Allie Young Green. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an Asian woman with long black hair and glasses wearing a purple blazer. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of the Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable and work at the Department of Justice Office for Access to Justice. Prior to this role in my legal career, I have worked as a legal aid lawyer and a nonprofit manager on federal grant funded programs. So this webinar's topic is something I have experienced from various perspectives. As Director Rossi noted, LAIR is a collaboration of 28 agencies whose mission is to advance access to justice for all people through improved coordination of federal programs. And you can learn more about LAIR's work on our website, justice.gov/ATJ/LAIR. So it should be in the chat as well. One of the central ways that federal agencies support people's access to justice is by providing funding to numerous community organizations, including many legal aid programs, to carry out their objectives such as housing stability, access to health care, supporting crime victims, and equitable access to education and job opportunities. And we know federal funding for legal aid is a topic of an enormous interest, just as Dr. Rossi mentioned. And we hear regularly from legal aid and other leaders about the need to make relevant information more broadly available. So we're excited to host this webinar with two experts who are incredibly knowledgeable on this topic, Karen Lash and Alison Paul, and my esteemed colleagues from ATJ, my Office for Access to Justice, Director Rossi, who will share some welcoming remarks, and Todd Vanuk and Justin Brooks, who will demonstrate the new federal funding resource that ATJ and LAIR launched recently. We'll start the conversation with Karen, who was the founding executive director of LAIR, and from whom I learned so much of what I know on this topic. And she now serves as a senior fellow at the Georgetown Justice Lab. So Karen, thank you for joining the presentation today.
Thanks so much, Allie. I am Karen Lash. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with salt and pepper, shoulder length hair that hints at my age. And I'm wearing a khaki V-neck sweater. And I am so honored to have worked with Allie in DOJ's Office for Access to Justice first iteration. And then honored again to work with Director Rachel Rossi in 2021 to help respond to President Biden's presidential memorandum, directing the Attorney General to restart the access to justice work and reinvigorate LAIR.
All right. Well, thank you for the intro, Karen. And could you start with sharing some overall landscape of federal funding for legal aid and any trends that you are seeing? And we'll share this slide that you prepared as well.
Terrific. So we know from the American Bar Association's online legal aid funding report that Director Rossi just referenced in her opening remarks. You can see a screenshot of the graph on this slide that shows that over the last 10 years, out of all of the different categories of funding sources for legal aid, the combined funding from federal government agencies, not including the Legal Services Corporation federal funds, shows the largest growth. It's that pink box on the right that shows the increasing proportion and growth, and it has tripled in a decade. As of 2021, it represents 37% of the funding pie, and that's a really big deal. I think there's another less visible, not charted, but really significant trend spurred in part by how many of these funding streams lead to de-siloing legal help. That is, these funds often also facilitate new partnerships with state and local governments, community health centers, veteran service organizations, and all kinds of other social service providers. This is one of the most exciting byproducts that I've observed over the years, and it really helps us get to why this webinar matters, which is helping people solve their problems, whether it's about housing, healthcare, employment, education, personal safety, family issues, because really tackling the problem usually requires legal help plus other kinds of help. And the collaborations can help make that happen more seamlessly.
Yes, and this certainly has been a focus of the ATJ and LAIR's collaboration with many federal agencies for over the years, raising awareness about the importance of incorporating legal help in various federal programs so that it can be more effective, right? And encouraging the multidisciplinary, person-centered approach to meet the communities and the individuals' needs in a holistic manner, which has to include their legal needs. So Karen, the world of federal funding can seem daunting to those who are less familiar. And there are so many different funding streams and many different rules. So to start us off, can you talk about the categories of funding so that we are all on the same page?
Absolutely. So LAIR has a super helpful page in its new online resource that Todd and Justin will share in just a bit. So I'm like the warm-up band. I'll briefly describe the two big buckets that, generally speaking, all the different federal funds fall into, one or the other. So we have on this slide the discretionary and pass-through categories, and some information that I will now go through. So the first bucket's grants are most commonly called discretionary. You may have also heard them called direct because you apply directly to the federal agency administering the funds, or competitive because you're competing with applicants from all over the country for the funds, or discretionary, which is really the label we're using for this category because the federal agency has discretion based on statutes and rules and regs and other kinds of guidance and very specific criteria, plus lots of process to ensure a fair competition. But they have discretion about who will be the actual grant recipients. And so the most common label is discretionary. The second bucket are federal pass-through funds. You've probably heard of block grants, formula funds, and some of you maybe even the super wonky sounding open-end reimbursement funds. There are hundreds of these that share some common criteria that gives them this pass-through name, because while they are federal funds, they are passed through to state, tribal, and local governments to spend and use. So for both buckets, the LAIR team, and a huge shout out to them, thank them often, please, they have curated those discretionary and pass-through funds that can allow for spending on legal assistance for lawyers, as well as different kinds of justice workers, navigators, accredited representatives, people who aren't lawyers, but provide some levels of legal help.
Okay, Karen, so you talked about discretionary and pass-through. Can you talk a little bit more about the pass-through funding? Because between the two, I think the pass-through funding is something they can be a little bit more difficult to figure out for those who are relatively new for federal funding, generally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there are at least three common denominators to the many different pass-through funds. So first, as I said, these are all federal funds, but they have state executive branch decision makers. Sometimes a local government will get a share of them, and so there'll be a local government executive branch decision maker when they get a share. That's who determines who can receive these pass-through funds and to do what. So applications or proposals that you might make go to that state or local government administrator, decision maker, not the feds. And the range of other eligible recipients of that particular funding pass-through funding stream are just within your state. It's a big difference from the first discretionary bucket where you're competing nationally. Second, states generally have lots of autonomy and flexibility about how to spend those pass-through dollars, within constraints, of course, like the authorizing federal statutes and federal rules, any other federal agency guidance documents, but there's a lot more leeway to decide local priorities and how to disseminate the funds. Third, states will almost certainly get their share. It's not automatic, but if a state, and when I refer to state, I'm meaning to include territories in the District of Columbia and tribes. But if that government entity fulfills all their federal requirements, and that usually includes forms and reporting requirements, maybe a strategic plan telling the federal agency how they're going to spend those funds within the various constraints. There may be matching money requirements, but as long as they follow all the rules, they're going to get their share. And that share is based on a set appropriated amount or statutory formulas that are related to the purpose of the funds, like the number of crime victims or the poverty population in your jurisdiction. So as Allie promised, that was kind of daunting and a little overwhelming. So feel free to put questions in the chat and I can try to answer them.
So thank you. That's such a helpful explanation to learn more about pass-through funding. And I note that because these funds are administered through state or local government agencies, it's so important to know which local agency in your state, in your region, administers such funding and how they do it, right? Because they may not look or sound the same, having different names depending on the jurisdiction. So Karen, you mentioned earlier that many of these federal funding programs require or encourage collaborations among legal aid and other service providers. Can you elaborate more on that point?
Yeah. So, and it's really important for the ultimate success of helping people solve their whole problem. And as you mentioned before, the success of the overall federal program, as well as knowing where the funds can come from. Because sometimes legal aid providers can collaborate and get funded without being the primary applicant for a discretionary grant or the direct recipient of pass-through funds from a state or local administering agency. So, for example, as pictured on this slide, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Supportive Services for Veterans Families discretionary grants are often awarded to a veterans service organization, but they can include in their application that they'll sub-grant to a justice partner to provide allowable kinds of legal help. Also shown here, maybe you work with a domestic violence shelter and they're receiving a pass-through Victims of Crime Act or VOCA Victims Assistance Formula funds from the state, and they want to include legal help for their survivors, so their budget includes a sub-award to your program. You might note that the slide also shows that this can work in reverse. You're the one getting the VOCA Victim Assistance Formula funds directly, and it's your program that provides a sub to the shelter that you often work with. So I'm just illustrating that it can work both ways. I'd also add a footnote about why, even though in these examples, the funds come to you from another nonprofit, you always have to care about the original funding source that you're getting because A, you're still responsible for compliance with all the federal rules on those funds, even if you're a sub. And B, knowing it's a federal source may inspire you to look for other collaborations. Are there other supportive services for veterans families grantees in your catchment area to reach out to? Doesn't seem right that some veterans are getting legal help while others are not. It's worthwhile conversation to reach out to other SSVF grantees. Are there other VOCA Victim Assistance Formula Fund awardees to partner with to provide the legal part of the wraparound services that survivors need? There may be other shelters in the area that are receiving VOCA formula funds and they aren't otherwise providing legal help, but they want to. Knowing the source of the funds opens up the possibility of other collaborations.
Those are such good examples, Karen. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm excited that later in the webinar, Alison Paul from Montana Legal Services Association will share some really concrete examples and share about how her organization has been partnering with many service providers across the region to use federal funding to meet their community's needs together. So turning to a different question, what about those federal funding programs that were created during the COVID-19 pandemic? What should our audience know about those?
Yeah, I love that question, and it's super timely. The 2021 American Rescue Plan Act, better known as ARPA, and its resources to respond to the COVID-19 emergency may seem like old news, but it's not. While it's pretty likely that many of the ARPA authorized funding sources that legal aid may have received, like different funding streams for housing stability and eviction prevention, they're probably all spent, but one in particular is worth investigating. The largest and most flexible funding that ARPA authorized is called the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, as shown on this slide. And states, counties, and some cities have to obligate any remaining funds they still have by December 31st, 2024, or they lose them. They have to send them back to the Treasury Department. Obligated means committing the funds to an activity that's allowed by the requirements for the funds. The administrator has to obligate the funds before the funds are available to be drawn down or dispersed. So long as the funds are obligated, by the end of this year, your state and local administrator has until the end of 2026 to actually spend them. So that means a couple more years of spending those dollars. And some fiscal recovery fund recipients still have unobligated funds. That's a potential opportunity for you to explore. And all those key dates that I mentioned are on this slide, along with some helpful resources about the fiscal recovery funds. So on the next slide, I think, there's more ARPA information. There's links to additional helpful information, like which jurisdictions got the fiscal recovery funds and how much. You might even live in a jurisdiction where the state, county, and city each got fiscal recovery funds allocated. So there may be more than one potential source to investigate. You'll also see on the slide 2 great sources from the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and National Conference of State Legislatures, who have been tracking how state and local governments are spending their shares of the funds, which is a really great way to research what's going on in your jurisdiction. Plus the National Center for State Courts Tiny Chats. Big shout out to Danielle and Zach. There's a recent one on this exact topic about obligating funds by the end of 2024, and that link is also on this slide.
Well, thank you for sharing this, Karen. We have a couple of minutes. Maybe you can answer 1 or 2 questions that are coming through the comments. Maybe I'll call out the first one. Do you know if there's any public list of where states, municipalities that have unspent funds?
No, I don't. If there is such a thing, definitely email and let me know. So it really requires you to identify who the administrator is and reaching out and asking.
And there's a lot of good information shared. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
I'm sorry, I would say one thing. There are some jurisdictions that have created dashboards where they are tracking themselves, like super transparent, how they're spending their funds, and some of those indicate what, if any, is still remaining, but it's not the majority of jurisdictions.
Got it. And I see, partly in response, another person, John Polk, has shared that there are still unallocated Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP Phase 2 funds of which 10% can be used for legal representation, according to NLIHC. About 5 billion is still unallocated, and he has shared a link there as well.
That's fantastic news. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I'm going to flag one more question and then move on to the next, and we'll come back to these lot of good questions towards the end. Is there a recommended way to tap into unspent or banked TANF funds?
Oh, well, I would go back to the original advice about finding the TANF administrator in your state in order to explore opportunities there. And TANF absolutely allows spending on legal assistance. So it's, thank you for raising awareness about that.
And then there's one question I think, Karen, you can answer pretty quickly. There's a question, are the discretionary funds tied to an application deadline, or can an organization apply on a rolling basis?
Virtually all the discretionary grants, meaning those that have a grant solicitation that comes directly from a federal agency, has a certain deadline that has no flexibility. So one of the things that I consider a good practice is if you anticipate, you know that a particular grant is going to become available, is to look at last year's grant solicitation to get yourself familiar. It may change some, but often it is very similar, so you really can get a jump on it.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing this incredibly helpful information. So now I'm going to turn to my ATJ colleagues to introduce a newly launched online resource. Now I'm passing it to you, Todd and Justin.
Thank you so much, Allie, and hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks to Karen as well for all of that invaluable information. My hope is to spend a few minutes introducing a recently announced resource that the Office for Access to Justice has unveiled. My name is Todd, and I work closely with Allie at the Office for Access to Justice. Justin, my colleague, will share the resource now on his screen. I'm also going to paste it into the chat for those who would prefer to browse it on your own. And briefly, the site offers more than 120 compiled federal funding opportunities from across the federal government. And these are opportunities that can support or have supported legal and related services. This is a robust category. I think the breadth of opportunities featured on the site is evidence of that. But despite the committed work of issuing agencies, these grants can at times be hard to locate, a challenge that we've heard about in our office from legal aid organizations and other stakeholders. Grant descriptions, solicitations, forecasts are sometimes spread across agency websites, and legal services are often one of many acceptable uses of a given agency's funding. So it's not always easy to identify and apply for these opportunities. Given these challenges and the import of this funding to both agencies and legal aid organizations, as I think our conversations today have highlighted, we're excited to offer a resource that brings a single bird's eye view of this category, that is federal funding opportunities for legal and related services. My colleague Justin will share a bit more detail about the site in just a moment, but I do want to add a couple of quick notes before I pass it along. The first is that this is very much resource version 1.0, and we at the Office for Access to Justice are eager to continue iterating, to offer semi-annual updates to its content, and to hear from you about questions or feedback that you have after using the site. I'll also note that this resource was informed by conversations with legal aid organizations, tested with several grant makers and prospective grantees, and finalized with support from LAIR's agency partners. And we're very grateful to all of those stakeholders for their truly invaluable input and assistance. With that, I'll pass things to Justin, who will give a quick rundown of the site's contents and functionality.
Thanks, Todd. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name is Justin. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white man with blonde hair, wearing a blue blazer, blue shirt, and blue striped tie. I work at the Office for Access to Justice with Allie and Todd, and I'm going to briefly demonstrate the new LAIR resource by showing what it contains, and more importantly, how you can use it to identify grants. First, I'd like you to look at this section here called Informational Resources. As you've heard, finding relevant grants is just one part of the grant process. After you've found a grant, there's a whole application process, and different grant-making agencies can have different requirements. So this informational resources section is intended to be a hub for learning how to track, locate, and apply for grants. As you can see here, there's a tab for federal funding types that goes over the differences between discretionary grants and pass-through grants. And there's another tab labeled grants.gov, which has some really great educational resources provided by grants.gov about the grants process. And there's a third tab here with information from agencies themselves about their grants. So if a grant making agency wants you to know something specific when applying for their grant, you'll find that here. But let's get to the main purpose of the resource, locating grants. And we'll use two grants as an example that you'll hear about shortly. As you can see here, grants on the webpage are organized in two ways, by agency and by issue area. Let's start with finding a grant by an agency. So if you click View By and go to View By Agency and click that, there's an expandable tab for each federal agency here. And so now we're going to go open the Health and Human Services tab. And we're going to go down and see under the Administration for Children and Families heading, there's the Medical Legal Partnership Plus grant. And each grant opportunity on the site features a short description about the grant and information about what type of grant it is. We'll hear more about this grant from Alison momentarily. There are also links to the grant solicitation, which provides specific instructions about eligibility requirements and how to apply. And there's also a link to program information, which will provide you with an overview of the grant program, often including relevant upcoming dates. Now, the application period for this specific grant has passed, but we still have it available on the site. If you're interested in this type of grant, it's still helpful to know of this offering and what the solicitation required, so that you can be better prepared when the program starts accepting applications again. And that's how you locate grants by agency. But you may also want to search grants by subject area. That is, grants supporting certain categories of legal or related services. In that case, you're going to want to go back up to View By, and instead of clicking Agency, you'll click on Issue Area. Now, it took you all the way down here. Let's say you're looking for a grant that deals specifically with housing. There are different tabs here that deal with different issue areas. Housing and homelessness is one of them. When you click on the Housing Homelessness tab, grants from different agencies related to housing and homelessness will appear. And many grants, including some listed here, will appear under multiple issue areas. So one example is the Eviction Protection Grants Program. Again, there's a brief description about the program, as well as a link to its solicitation and program information. So that's a brief overview of how the site works. And with a reminder that the resource is linked in the chat for those interested, I'll now turn things back to Allie. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Todd and Justin, for walking us through the new resource from ATJ and LAIR, which I hope many of you will take a look. You have the link here, and also to visit periodically as a helpful resource. Now I'm going to turn to Alison Paul, Executive Director of Montana Legal Services Association, who will talk about how it all really works from the legal aid perspective. So Alison, if you want to come on video. So thank you so much for joining the webinar. We're eager to hear from you as you've been tremendously successful in tapping into a wide array of federal funding programs over the years to address your community's needs. To start us off, can you tell us a little bit about the legal aid program you lead and how the funding from federal agencies have been supporting that work?
Sure, thank you, Allie. My name is Alison Paul. My pronouns are she and her. And I always say I'm a middle-aged white woman from Kansas with brown hair and glasses. So if that gives you a picture. Montana Legal Services is a statewide program, and we are an incredibly rural state. So the largest community in Montana is about 100,000 people. And we have 6 people per square mile, to which I always add, we have 24 cows per square mile, to give you a picture. In fact, my IT guy got stuck in a cattle drive yesterday, and you can't be a legal aid lawyer or staff at MLSA without getting stuck at some point in a cattle drive as you're trying to drive around. You haven't lived, let me tell you. But we, federal funds are really important to our funding because the state of Montana is so rural. We have one large law firm, right? We don't, and the large law firms that have offices here don't give money here. They give money where their headquarters are, right? We have hardly any large corporations. It's not the same in terms of our ability to access funds. So we have turned to federal funds and have been really successful in moving forward and figuring out what federal funds will fit well with our work. And a lot of that has been due to LAIR, starting in, when they were around the first time, really getting in there and looking and seeing what's there and developing the ability to manage and solicit and ask for federal funding.
Thank you for starting us off and giving us the perspective and overview. When we are having some prep conversation, the list that we are creating of all the federal funding that you could be sharing with this audience was quite long. So we love for you to start with a shorter list, but a combination of both direct funding as well as pass-through funding. And Todd, if you want to put up the slide that has a list, that would be helpful for the audience as well.
Sure. So we get quite a bit of federal funding. And I'll talk about the ones that are up here. So we do sponsor an AmeriCorps grant where and that is quasi-state pass-through. I'll try to say whether it's pass-through or discretionary. Most AmeriCorps funding originally will come through your Commission on Community Service. In Montana, it's the Governor's Commission on Community Service. And we applied there for a couple years and then went into a national pool of money, which is important because the national pool has a lot more money than the state pool. And so most of our grants are very heavily into partnerships, right? So we partner with agencies because AmeriCorps is a 50% or a 1-to-1 match, right? So to be able to have the money to do an AmeriCorps program, the first time we looked at it, we said, this doesn't make any sense financially for us. And then we figured out a way to do a cost share model. And so we partner with state government, the Innocence Project, the public defenders, we have partnered with the Consumer Protection Office, and everybody pays a certain share of the cost, including the cost of our staff to administer it. And it works out to about $11,000 a year. So to get a full-time person, because that's the way our AmeriCorps works, for 11 months for $11,000 is a pretty good deal for most of these agencies. And that opened up, because we have an AmeriCorps program, we qualified for the for the Corporation for National and Community Service Volunteer Generation Fund. Most of legal aid agencies have a pro bono program. And so by going through the Volunteer Generation Fund, we got money for building out a learning management system for our volunteers, right? It was something that was not related to AmeriCorps so much as related to an ability to get that money, right? HUD, I think a lot of legal aid programs get some sort of HUD money. We actually have, when we talked the other day, Allie, I forgot, we have 4 streams of HUD money. One of them is a community development block grant, and that comes through a city, right? So you have to, we haven't been able to get into that pot till fairly recently. With the housing crisis, it became more and more important to the cities that, hey, they need to put some money into helping with eviction defense, right? We do have a partnership with Idaho and Utah Legal Services for the Eviction Protection Grant Program, where we all have staff and we're looking at the rural use of rural eviction protection work. And so to be competitive, that grant came out a year or 2 ago, and we looked at it and said, we're not going to be competitive by ourselves. We need some partnerships. We need to make this a little bigger so that it will be competitive federally, right? So that's part of what we always look at. We have a youth homeless demonstration project grant. So we have a whole coordinator for homeless youth that does intake and outreach, and then can feed those cases through, and it will pay for some of the legal work too. So we write outreach, we write coordination and intake, and then legal services into a lot of these grants, as a way to cover all of the services our program provides, right? And then we have a housing counseling grant that we've had forever through partnership with Western Tennessee Legal Services. There's maybe, I don't know how many partners they have, but we all get some money for housing counseling. And I am truly grateful that Western Tennessee handles the administrative part of that HUD grant, because HUD grants can be a bear, right? We do have, so the Medical Legal Partnerships Plus grant came out a few years ago, and we've had partnership with federally qualified health centers in rural areas for 10 years. And so we applied for it, and it's a kind of an expansion grant, and we were able to add urban Indian health centers to that. And again, the partnerships, the bringing together people to talk about legal services. And in fact, our medical legal partnership is I call it a pay to play grant. So they have to, it's not grant funded anymore other than this new part of it. It's funded by all the partners, and they each pay a certain amount of money a year, and they get legal services for all their clients. And then the Department of Justice has been a very strong partner with a lot of legal aid agencies. I think, there's the VOCA funding, which is a pass-through that comes through in Montana, it's the Board of Crime Control, right? And so we apply for money through that. That money, as most of us know, has gone up and down and up and down. And then we do have some direct grants from the Office of Victims of Crime. There was a period when VOCA funding was, both through the state and through the feds, was a lot higher. I don't know that they have any direct grants available right now, but they have had them over time. And so we've had one for rural technology that helped us develop some partnerships and a website. We had one for representing victims of crime in criminal proceedings, which was really a fascinating project. That one, there's several of legal aids that had got that one, and that one's going away this year. And then the good old Office on Violence Against Women, Legal Assistance for Victims grant program, which is discretionary, coming from the government. It is highly competitive, so most of us tend to get a few of those, and then we sit out a year, and then we get another one. We're in a sit out year for one of our grants, but we have successfully convinced the Office on Violence Against Women. They used to have a restriction on their funding that said you could only get this much money from this source, or you could only, and you couldn't partner with more than one agency. And in rural areas, that just doesn't work. There is no other legal aid for our shelters to partner with, and there is not enough money in any one grant to do the whole state. So we could have convinced them, not through lobbying, of course, because we don't lobby, but we have convinced them that restriction does not work in a rural state. And so they have removed that. But we have partnerships with several domestic violence shelters, either for the LAV grant, or the legal assistance for victims, or for their rural grant, which also has legal assistance in it. And we help build the capacity of the shelters to get that funding, but also we help we help then provide the legal services for that area that the shelter serves. So we have quite a few more federal grants, and those are the highlights I wanted to talk about.
And Alison, what a highlight they are. So thank you so much for walking through them. And I was thinking about, let's ask about what the strategies that she's employing to successfully access these funding sources. And it seems like the strategy number one, maybe the partnerships, right? The cities, other legal aid organizations, other service providers, and you make it sound so easy. And for those who don't find it easy, can you share any thoughts or advice on how to go about to build, to strengthen, and actually make them work for the purposes of grant application and management on an ongoing basis?
Sure. I have three tips I wanted to give, or three things that I think are really important. And one of them is partnerships and setting them up in advance, like knowing who your natural allies are and being creative about where you can deliver services, and understand that they don't always work the first time around. We do have one of the veterans grants that Karen talked about. And in Montana, it has taken us like 3 years to get them to send us referrals. So the first time we partnered with them, we didn't get anything, right? And now, 3 years later, we're really figured out what we need to do, and training their staff on making referrals regularly, going to staff meetings, devoting time to that, making them understand why this is important to their client base. That's something that we've done. You know, our AmeriCorps partnerships are all around thinking about who does similar things for our client base, who needs intake, outreach, and referral assistance. That's what all of what they do, right? So partnerships, and I'm happy to answer questions later, or you can reach out to me later on any of this. The other thing I'd say, the second thing, is that find things that fit with what you want to do and what you think you can support the partnerships, because you never want to be in that square hole problem where you're really trying, like you're throwing everything out to the wind and seeing what matters. We have been very successful because we have really found the ones that seem to fit with what we want to do and been able to successfully explain that, you know, and just like any other funder, you look at what have they funded in the past, who has, you know, what have they funded, what are the size of the awards, know the landscape, the HUD eviction defense. I think they only gave 8 or 10 of them in the country. And so we looked at that and said, this is more money than we'd apply for by ourselves, but let's find a couple of other programs that would want to do something similar and go in together. And that, I think, is what made us successful. And there's a question in the chat that I'm going to address next, which is that when is it? It's a lot of work to do federal grants, and how do you look at lots of small contracts versus a big contract? So we just have 2 development people, and almost all they do is grants, right? In Montana, we have another agency that does the heavy lifting on the fundraising. But again, we don't have a lot of fundraising to do because it's not as, we put our money where our opportunity is, right? And then I am a firm believer at a certain point in getting an indirect cost rate. That is what helps you manage grants, right? So if you get a federally approved indirect cost rate, ours right now is 28%. And then we take 28% of the salary. We picked the personnel one, the salary and fringe, and that comes off the top of any federal grant. And that has really helped us have the infrastructure. We have a grants manager, we have, you know, an accounting staff, we have the infrastructure to be able to support the services and the federal grants, because it does take infrastructure to be able to do it. And there is a tipping point, and I'm not sure I can answer where that tipping point is, because you could do a whole, somebody asked about getting a federally, we could do a whole webinar on that, and maybe Allie wants to organize that later, or you can reach out to me, and our finance person knows how to do that. It is not easy, but once you get it down, it is not hard. It's just time consuming, but it definitely makes a difference in your ability to afford things. So I think the only other question was about social workers and federal funding. We have gotten social workers. It just really depends on the funding source. It depends on what how do you look at that, and what do you want to put in that makes sense to deliver the product that you want to deliver. So.
Well, Alison, the chat is not stopping. There are a lot of questions, as well as other knowledgeable participants answering other people's questions. So this is wonderful, and I think there's no way we can cover all the questions, but we are making a list, and we'll look for ways to address, and we'll share them with you as well, Alison. And thank you, really appreciate you sharing such helpful information. We have just about 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes remaining for the webinar. And Karen, I'm going to turn back to you if you wouldn't mind coming back on video, as I'd love for you to share some resources about accessing federal funding that you think would be helpful to our audience, because there are some limitations what we can put on the government website.
Right. First, I want to endorse the idea of having a separate space to talk about the indirect cost rate. I'm a big believer. But to your question. So the National Legal Aid and Defender Association's legalaidresources.org website has a lot of valuable federal grant information. Please visit it. It also includes the toolkit that I created with my amazing research assistants at American University when I ran the Justice in Government project, which took the LAIR lessons to state and local governments. A big thank you to NLADA for absorbing that toolkit. So the information hasn't been updated since 2021, but it's still useful. It includes research briefs in Module 1. There's a link directly on the slide. The research briefs curate research about legal aid in a wide range of topics to really help you make the findings more bite-sized and accessible. But the bottom line is legalaidresources.org has information about discretionary and pass-through funds. It has my Justice and Government Project grants matrix, which is a really clunky PDF, but it's got a lot of good information about pass-through funds, and that's in Module 2 in the toolkit. There's a link. And the State Justice Institute, which is a congressionally created entity that provides grants to improve the quality of justice in state and local courts. They have a funding toolkit for state courts and their justice system partners that includes information about federal discretionary and pass-through funds. Tara Kunkel, a rural justice systems guru, she provides the content for the discretionary side, and I do the pass-through funds content. 2 final quick tips. First is that, as has been referenced by several people, with the pass-through funds, it can be really tricky to find the individual administrators, which is the absolute step 1. Is then you're going to research what their priorities are and do they have a state plan, their funding history, et cetera. But you need to know who it is and what part of government it sits in. So, for example, the VOCA victim assistance formula funds in one state are administered by someone in the Office of Emergency Services. In another, it's the State Attorney General's office. In another, the Department of Corrections. Allison had another office that administers it. It can be a real Where's Waldo kind of search. So to fix that, in the Justice and Government Project toolkit found at legalaidresources.org, the Module 2's grants matrix, when we could find a centralized source for state and local administrators of a particular funding stream, we put it in the last column. So note it hasn't been updated since 2021, but many of those links will still work. Same with the State Justice Institute's funding toolkit pass-through content. When we can find a centralized source, we put it in there. The second final tip is a huge topic like indirect cost rates that we're not really covering here, but is extremely important, and that is compliance with federal requirements. The latest issue of the MIE Journal has an article about compliance that I co-authored with Scott Scheffler and Rosie Griffin and their amazing expertise, both from the Feldsman LAIR law firm. Shout out to them, and to MIE for letting us share it here. So the URL for that article is also on this slide.
And this is Allie. And in the chat, the link to the slides are being pasted here, so you can access that Karen has prepared. So Karen, thank you again for sharing these resources, incredibly helpful. With a couple minutes remaining, I too have a couple of tips that I wanted to share with everyone as well. So much has been shared already, but just a couple of things I want to note. The first one being, making sure utilizing people to utilize the program-specific resources from funding agencies. Everyone should know about the fact that once the solicitation is out, many of the agencies provide pre-application webinars and also provide a staff contact information for prospective applicants. So I think there were some questions about like how you find out the current or past awardees are. It depends on agencies, but again, that too is a type of information that you could likely find on the agency website, as well as the links to all the information to grants.gov. The second one I'll share is that if you have relevant subject matter expertise, which I believe many of you do as legal aid lawyers and justice professionals, consider applying to serve as a peer reviewer for a federal grant program. Many agencies utilize qualified subject matter experts to evaluate grant applications and to advise the agency. And I can tell you from my personal experience, serving as a peer reviewer provides a fantastic window into that evaluation process. And those opportunities are not hard to find if you look into the agency websites. And Justin is going to add some examples of such sites in the chat. Okay, great. All right. So we do have a couple of minutes remaining. There's a question about the link to the MIE article. It can be found in the slides, in the slide deck that's been shared. Let's see. Karen and Allison, if there are any particular questions that are coming through you'd like to answer and respond to, I think we have a couple of minutes or just a minute. Oh, and I'm so glad Justin also shared the Public Defense Resource Hub that ATJ has recently developed and launched. That includes information on federal funding for public defense providers, and the link is in the chat, and also through the ATJ website.
Sorry, I was finding the link to the federal compliance article.
Karen, maybe I'll throw this one question to you before we wrap up. Is there a different place that indigent defense providers should look at for grants applicable to them? I didn't see much for that community on the resources here.
Well, I should defer back to you. ATJ has a new resource for that. I think did I see it in the link?
We did.
Chat?
And it also has a contact information for my ATJ colleague who's a point person. So please feel free to reach out. Allison, is there anything you want to share? We are about to wrap up.
Nope, nothing. I'm happy to answer questions, or we're very helpful to people because federal funding can be such a morass to get through, to be successful at. So we share all of our tips.
And back to LAIR 1.0, Allison was always like among the first to be on it. Whatever the new federal funding source became known and available, Allison was first to raise her hand.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, 1 hour that we had for the webinar went by really fast, talking about federal funding for legal aid. So again, I want to thank the speakers for making this webinar possible and for everyone who have tuned in today. And when you exit the webinar, you'll be presented with a short feedback survey via WebEx. So we would really appreciate it if you could take 2 to 3 minutes to provide your feedback. So thank you, and this concludes the webinar.
Thank you.